So I was talking with my brother. I was saying, hey, man, if at some point I can't play, I don't know my name, I'm just really sick in the hospital, please come and play music for me. And then my brother, being sly as he is, he said, I'll put an eternal boombox in your grave. And it just stuck.
Take a little break from the crazy, try to recalibrate. Every day seem to be hazy, I see doom. Everybody's sick with obsession, it's hard to navigate. Take your baggage out of my space, I need room. Reset. New world order. Reset. New world order.
Thank you to all of the folks tuning in to the Stir Crazy Podcast. I am your host, JP Reynolds. On this podcast, I have been having some really amazing dynamic conversations with some really amazing dynamic people. Really, really amazing dynamic people who are representing all types of fields, spanning lots of different disciplines. And I'm really excited tonight, in particular for 3 reasons. This episode happens to be on my birthday week. That's number 1. It is my birthday, January 27th, it's my born day. And I'm very excited to have this conversation framed under the calendar alignment with my birthday. Very excited. Number 2, I am a music artist. And for the listeners of this podcast, you will notice that I have not actually had any conversations with other music artists yet, which is a bit ironic. But here we are. And not only am I talking to a brilliant music artist, who I'm going to talk about in a second, but this is the first episode in a series of episodes. This is kicking off a Black History Month, music-oriented Black music maker conversation series. So I'm going to be talking to artists, people in fields or in positions that are music adjacent or music oriented. And I'm really excited about that because it's very important to me. And I'm very glad to be having these conversations. And then the third reason that I'm so excited is my guest, my very special, illustrious guest for this episode of the Stir Crazy Podcast. He's very special and very illustrious for many reasons. I have known this person for a very long time. Not only is he a brilliant artist, a brilliant pianist, like for real, y'all, I could talk maybe all podcast episode about how brilliant of a pianist Julian Reid is. I won't do that because we're going to talk about other things as well. But this is a brilliant artist. So many disciplines, so much range. Not only is he an artist, but he is a theologian. One of the reasons I'm really excited to talk to him on this episode, especially kicking off music conversations, is because we have what I would call cousin approaches to being artists, right? We come from spaces that really care deeply about theology, about how God is operating in our world, how Creator is operating in our spaces as creatives. And I really respect the way he's doing things with blending different disciplines. And yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation with him. He's got all types of institutions attached to him. He's collaborated with all types of fire artists. I could brag about him, but I won't do that. I'm going to just introduce him. Julian Reid from Chi-Town, Chicago's in the building. Thank you for joining me.
What's good, bruh?
And yeah, man, first of all, I just want to know, how are you? Where are you? Have you been drinking water? What's good with you, baby?
What excellent questions, man. Thank you so much for having me here, bro, and for, again, giving us time to commune. I remember actually, to this day, all the times we would eat lunch together in undergrad, and the way I looked up to you when you were the president of Black Men's Union, and I was in your stead. So thank you so much for, yet again, another time to commune. Anyway, I'm feeling thankful. I am feeling grateful and feeling quite encouraged for what I've been able to come to understand about myself and the world in the last couple of months. And I'm excited to get more into that too, so that's a bit of a cliffhanger. And I'm up here in Chicago, born and bred here, like you said, back here with my wife. We just came back from Atlanta, So Atlanta's fresh on the brain, but Chicago is the place to be. And yeah, I'm just hopeful that for the rest of the journey, I can call this place home. So it's just feeling good to be back, feeling good to be making music and have all these self-realizations kind of in flow right now.
Yeah, man. Self-realizations is like the name of the last year and change. Exactly. For sure.
Yeah, man.
For sure. You know, both of us came out of or went through divinity school, went through an academic process of divinity school, and have been in traditional ministry spaces. And we ask a lot of questions about how our creative lives are tuned to that experience and also informed by that experience. So I just want to jump into this convo, man, and just hear from you about the self-realization that you've experienced in that regard and where you are in that process, bro. You know, it's quite a journey to be making music in particular with that perspective.
Yeah, man. So in a sentence, what I've come to realize is I need to trust my joy. And trusting my joy has meant a lot of collaborations. I'm in a band, the JuJu Exchange, and we have a few projects out and are working on our third. And so that's been amazing, been in that for years now. But then there's also the realization that God has given me a whole lot to express on my own, a whole lot to express by fusing the various passions that I have for music, for theological thinking, for writing, for speaking. And so what I've come to realize is not only do I need to fuse the verbs, the writing, the playing, the speaking, I even need to fuse the identities. So I've been trying to toe this line for the last few years between artist and theologian, where at school I'm taking classes, like you were discussing, on various theologians, and my art was of interest to folk, but it was kind of like a curiosity, like, oh, you were in a studio session, oh, that's cool, right? You kind of just as something outside of the norm of that world. Yeah. Now on the other side, when I'm in the studio working with folk, even when I'm playing in church, I am talking about faith in a way that sounds like a grad student would be talking about faith, but very different from the way other musicians are often expressing, or different from the people in the choir pews, or wherever it is. And so I felt the tension between being both on the bandstand and then also being in the classroom. But what came to light just recently, probably in the last 6 months, was that I live at the hyphen. I mean, many of us, if not all of us, are hyphenated, and my hyphen is between the two. So I go by the title now, artist-theologian, on purpose. Not theological artist, not artistic theologian, because I don't want one modifying the other. The two sit hand in hand, and it allows me then to think expansively about what it means to be one who both creates and reflects equally. And artists are called to create, and theologians are called to reflect. And I get to do those verbs fused together. And so now I go by the sentence, I'm an artist theologian who plays, writes, and speaks at the intersection of music, faith, and story for my village. So that's where I am.
For your village too.
Yeah.
And creating and reflecting. That's powerful, man. One of the things that you do really well is tell stories through non-worded expression.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, I didn't know you was going to get that on this podcast, did you? We got live instrumentation on this episode, baby. What's poppin'? Nah, I mean, that was a perfect example, though, right? Because what you do in studio, on stage, in pulpit, in classroom, is you do this translation, right? You translate. And I think that's so important, especially these days, especially right now.
Yeah.
Right, because what you just played was to me, what I heard right? As a listener, as a creative and reflecting person, what I heard was gratitude. I heard gratitude just then, right? I heard that translated in those keys you just expressed through, after you just literally said, thank you, man, right?
Oh, wow.
Right? You said, thank you, man, and then you played gratitude. At least that's how I heard it.
That's beautiful.
That type of translation is why, one, I'm so thankful for the work you're doing and the obedience that you've answered with to your call, because I think that's something we've talked about too, right?
Yes.
Like, especially being in divinity school or being in an academic, more traditional space, is like, well, what am I supposed to do with this thing now? How am I supposed to use this training, this platform, these institutions? What am I supposed to do with this now? That will always be a question for me. That's something that I've gotten clear on this past year, is that's always going to be a question.
Yes.
But one thing that I'm grateful for is that you are providing a model for what that looks like for people who want to be creative, but people who also want to reflect. And I thought that was a great way to talk about the fusion that you've created.
Man, thank you.
Yeah.
And I can relate to you on that question. You know,
Yeah.
How do you sit in the traditional space while also wanting to sit outside of it? And I think the challenge for artists, which is not necessarily the challenge for musicians or the challenge for people who write text, but I think the challenge for artists, people who are making original stuff, is that it always ends up it has to sit somewhat outside of whatever box the institution creates. It just kind of has to. There's just no way to create what doesn't exist and comply with all of the rules and norms. And I'm not even disparaging them. I think it's impossible to live without rules and norms. So it's not like I'm saying that's all booty, but rather art requires to look beyond the four walls and to see what's not there and see what's not yet, and then call that into being. So then if you are trained and groomed in traditional spaces and feel any kind of allegiance to them or fidelity to them, then you end up necessarily, it seems to me, at this crossroads of both attending to institutional bounds and parameters and also thinking beyond them for the sake of what isn't yet. So I empathize with you. I tip my hat, and we're on this journey together for sure, because that's a great joy of having both kinds of formation.
Yeah. And those institutions exist everywhere, right?
Yes.
Right? I mean, when we talk about traditional structures, that can mean, in this conversation, that can mean the church.
Yep.
That could also mean like maybe the music industry.
Yeah,
right?
Speak about it. Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's the thing that I confront often, right? And that's something that I got clear on in this past year, was not being affiliated with any institution. Like right now, I'm completely divested from institutions, which is for better and for worse, right? That is a really difficult space to be in, and that's not a space I necessarily want to be in, but it's one I find myself. And I always wonder how much impact that has on the creative process itself, or the vocational process, right? Like hearing the call, what role the institution plays, whatever institution, right, across the spectrums of institutions, because as we said, there's institutions everywhere, but across the spectrum of institutions, I wonder what role the institution plays in how we live out the call, right? And that's something I know we both take seriously, like vocation, like literally the voice, vocation being the call, the voice of God, the voice of Creator, the voice that's internal. How do you navigate that? Because again, you're navigating that right now, and part of it is with identity and framing of your identity to help give guidance to how you want to show up. Yeah. But how are you navigating that, man?
Yeah, I navigate that with joy as a rudder, and that hasn't always been the case. But I've come to really cleave to joy as a means of finding my way. Because before, the rudder was more so duty or reputation acknowledging or something like that. And that's what I would use to articulate what I was doing. But if I looked at my life, over the shoulder, and I looked at the decisions I was making about who my friends would be, who my people would be, about where I wanted to go, what I was willing to leave behind, I wasn't actually making decisions based on the duty that I was articulating. So even though it gave me much angst when I would think, I'm not adhering to X, Y, and Z standard that I think should be the norm, black guy out of Yale should go and stay on Wall Street, and I was interning there, had my sights set there for a long time. But when I was there, I was like, no, this clearly isn't it. And I had no problem leaving. But then I had a problem justifying why I left after I left. So duty was, for a lot of my 20s, the thing I was really contending with in the wrong way, because I think there's a beautiful way to honor duty, honor communities that you feel beholden to. But that wasn't really what I was doing. It was just like this mythical image of the perfect self or the ideal or the normal self that I was supposed to be striving for. But now, like I said at the beginning, trusting my joy, it's made it a lot easier to try to sit with what is meaningful and holding to what is meaningful and really following God in ascertaining what's meaningful. And as I ascertain with God what is meaningful, then the relevant opportunities, then the relevant income, then everything that needs to be added unto me is added. But it's when I keep God at the center that then actually flows correctly. When I put money at the center or some other kind of fuel that shouldn't be at the center but ends up at the center, that's when things start running awry. And then I start thinking about the other cats in my year, the other cats in my echelon who are doing X, Y, and Z, and I'm not. My wife is a doctor, and I start looking at her and what she's doing, how that's legible, to certain populations. But yeah, that's when I keep all the wrong things at the center. When I actually focus on looking God in the face as opposed to Andrew Jackson in the face, then I'm actually able to prioritize accordingly, and then that's when the joy really takes root. So I've been on that kick for the last little while. COVID has given me a lot of time to reflect about what's at the root, what's at stake, and that has then led to an explosion of creativity. And I guess the last thing I would say is, in addition to trusting my joy, which flows from staring God in the face, what I've also seen is that at bottom, because I am a creative, I always have resources I can be drawing on. Now, everybody is a creative in my mind. We were all created to be creators. But especially if you're a professional creative and you're trying to make your money off of what you can call into being from nothing, that means that there really can't be any roadblock to you doing expression. You may not do it the way you want to, due to money, not having record support like I don't have either. But man, there's just always something to say, always something to express, and there's always somebody there who needs to hear it. And that's the other thing that I'm realizing, and that really fuels me in the work.
There's always somebody there who needs to hear it.
Even if that's just me, and let alone somebody else too,
Yeah. That's actually really, really powerful. I've said before on the podcast, and I've been saying for a couple years now, for me to stay in alignment, similar to how you talk about joy, or centering joy, or centering God instead of Andrew Jackson. Part of that, and the phrase you just said, there's always somebody who needs to hear it. Part of what's helped me out in terms of being this artist and reflecting is I would always focus on the people who didn't show up, people who didn't respond, the folks who didn't share, the folks who didn't support in whatever way I was thinking that it was. But then I was like, yo, what if I just focus on the people who did?
Yeah, bro.
What if I shifted my focus to the people who did show up, even if it was 5 people, even if it was just the homie who's always the one who shows up? What if I just focus on that and get back in focus, or get back in alignment with gratitude, which, leads to joy? And that's powerful. There's always someone there who needs to hear it.
That reminds me of the story that just took place that I am going to just now carry with me forever. Yeah. So throughout this last year, I've been trying to figure out how to get, bigger paying gigs and find new stages. And, I had the privilege to play some amazing people this past year. I played with Jennifer Hudson back in November, and Heather Headley, and that was dope. But what was so interesting was that just a couple weeks ago, I started this online preaching series called A Creative's Word.
Yes.
And it's a series where I'm speaking, where I'm playing, and going back and forth for 10, 15 minutes over a scripture text. So it's like a sermon in a traditional sense, but it's online, it's on a Friday night, I'm playing as well as speaking, and the word is particularly directed at those who are creatives, those who fancy themselves as such. Now, of course, in parentheses, I think everybody's creative, so technically, hopefully this can reach anybody, but that's always where my mind tends to go. Okay, so I've been doing it for the last couple of weeks, just on Facebook, on YouTube, free of charge. It'll always be free of charge. I want to serve people, want to bless people, and get my name out there, through the work I'm doing, but let it always be over socials. So there's this woman who shows up, also an alum with us, JP, and she watches for weeks, and I all of a sudden look at my phone, and she's Venmo me $20.
Bruh.
And never once did I say anything about monetizing. Don't even say subscribe to me. I mean, if you do, great. But never talked about money. This isn't why I'm doing it. And yes, she just sent it and said, thank you for the music and the teaching. And I was stunned. Now, I share this because those $20, again, from the person in the room, meant so much more to me than the big old checks I was looking for last year and what I got playing with Jennifer Hudson in terms of notoriety or people opening their eyes. You said, you did what? With whom? Like being on TV all over the country. Those $20 from her saying thank you for your music and for your teaching.
Yeah.
When I wasn't expecting it, that went deep in a way nothing else did in terms of payment, perhaps ever. And so it was just a good reminder from God to prioritize the mission, not the monies. And it therefore made the monies I got from this so much more meaningful, not because it was a big number, but because it was so earnest, so sincere, and was in response to me speaking from the genuine. I'll just keep that story. So anyway, I share that with you and with anybody else on this podcast who needs to be encouraged about what it means to do work and receive compensation. What does it mean to be compensated? Yeah, so that's a big question I think creatives always have to be asking and answering as we try to figure out how to evaluate ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. What equals the compensation? That story reminds me of, I don't know if you have this in Chicago, but in New York, we got these pizza shops all over the place, so like small mom and pop shops. And what they used to do all the time, and some of them still do this, is they would keep like the dollar bill or the first $5 bill behind the register. They would put it on the wall. Yeah. Right? And it's like they just kept that up there because it held a particular significance because it was the first $5 bill they got. Or, it was a $5 bill from the homeless dude who never could pay. They always gave him a slice, but then one day he came in and gave a $5 bill, right? Wow. It's like these like really powerful stories that are attached to the significance of the story behind that money instead of just the money itself. And I think about these Venmo, these Cash Apps that people send stuff on, right? It's like, dang, I wish I could. I might. This is giving me the idea. I'm like, maybe I'll frame some of these. People just be dropping bread, didn't ask for no bread, just did a thing to gift it or whatever, and it's like $20 in the Venmo. Yeah, that means a lot. That means a lot.
It does. It does, man. It does. And for as icky as money can be, when it can work like that, it just has such beautiful symbolic value, and. Yeah, I'm thankful, especially in the midst of COVID, that folk are looking out for artists these ways, that folk are looking to receive new things in these ways. When the pandemic started, there was actually a big problem for musicians where you couldn't tour, and so you couldn't really make the money that people typically made from their art. And then their double whammy was, if you wanted to release new music, a lot of folk actually weren't that keen on listening to new music because so much was unstable. And as such, people instead were reverting to oldies and goodies. And so that then made it hard two ways, you can't be in front of folk and folk ain't even really trying to listen to new things you might want to put out to get new streams.
Facts.
So it was just a really hard time. I think it's settled out a little. The dust is settled and people are keen on trying to, deal with their pent up interests for live entertainment. So I'm thankful it's changed, but all that to say, these kinds of symbolic gestures not only mean something in terms of what it means to do something for free and get help, but it also means something really powerful during a time where so much feels so precarious around the artist and her worth.
Facts, man. So, you mentioned some new work, and like you mentioned, you're in the JuJu Exchange. You're founding member of that crew. Really dope music.
Thanks, man.
And y'all did release some new music this year.
Yes, sir.
Which I loved.
Thank you.
The Eternal Boombox.
Yes.
I loved it. Can you talk to me a little bit about the significance of the Eternal Boombox?
Sure.
Because I hear the music, I heard the music, and I know you. And I'm just like, oh, this is so deep. Because again, you tell stories without using words, right? There's so many stories. First of all, you floated. Like musically, the whole thing was a float. The whole thing was a vibe, right? But then I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I have stories to some of this music. I wonder what not only the whole crew's, perception of these stories here are, but I really wonder what Julian is. I really wonder where his mind is at, because right, I think of you as a thinking soul, right? Because you're a thinker. You were like a philosophy major at Yale, right? I mean,
that's right. Yeah, I was.
Right, but you're also like this soulful artist. And
thank you, bro.
A lot of times we don't give space for the two things to coexist.
My God.
But you know what I'm saying? But I think you hold that space in a really fascinating way. So I was like, yo, what is he thinking? So could you break that? Just like the phrase, the Eternal Boombox, because that's so full.
Yeah, man.
That phrase is so full to me.
Thank you, bro. So that actually came from this really powerful conversation that my brother Novazai and I had. Novazai's on percussion, and he does a lot of production as well in the band. So we were working on this record a couple years ago, and we were working on the tune that would come to be known as Eternal Boombox. And while we were working on it, for some reason during that time, I was thinking about music and memory. And if you're not familiar with it, music is really, really powerful at being able to get past dementia and other kinds of mental problems that people have towards the end of their lives. It's able to get past that deterioration and lock you into memories from 60, 70, 80 years ago. So people may forget their name, but if you play their favorite song from when they were 15, this 95-year-old can sing all the words. So I was, for some reason, thinking about that at that time, particularly Alzheimer's and how memory slips and how music can counteract that. And something about the way this song sounded reminded me of this. So I was talking with my brother, and I was saying, hey man, if at some point I can't play, I don't know my name, I'm just really sick in the hospital, please come and play music for me. And then my brother, being sly as he is, he said, I'll put an eternal boombox in your grave. And it just stuck. And it then just became this beautiful way to not only think about the tune, but then even think about the whole project. How do you make beauty out of loss? And that is what actually the whole project is getting at, where these 5 songs accord with each stage of the 5-stage theory of grief. So the first stage being shock, denial, that's I can't see my eyes, right? What do you mean I can't see my eyes? I see all the time out of them. And then realizing, oh shoot, I actually can't see them myself. I'll never be able to see them. All I'll ever be able to see is a reflection, right? So shock, denial around that. And then the second is Avalanche, which is for anger. That song just had a whole lot of firepower. Novazai really took that into his lab and just went crazy on it. And that also has my sister, Rebecca, playing harp. If you listen carefully, you'll hear the harp going back and forth with the rocked out synth. And then the third track is Eternal Boombox. In that track, we had Tank from Tank and the Bangas, also Albert Allenback from Tank and the Bangas, come and help us out with that one. And she just gave a beautiful poem Tank did at the end, where she's talking about when your memories fade, I hope I'm not on the last page reading alone. And it's just a beautiful poem that talks about contending with your finitude, contending with death. But the cool thing I love about that track is that the melody, that melody shows up at the beginning and in the middle and at the end, but it always shows up a little different each time, as if being a child, you hear something and it's fresh. Then maybe as a teenager, you go and be rebellious, but then you still hear that line, maybe from a parent, maybe a sensation or an impression from something you had while young. And then you go off and you go into adulthood and maybe things get hazy from your childhood, but that stays with you. And then as you enter the sunset stage, cue Tank, then you hear it back, but you don't hear it back in the same way you did when it was young. It's now hazy. Like she even says on the track, a hazy afternoon, a short June.
That's what's going on there. Okay.
Yeah. So the melody that comes back in different iterations throughout the track is symbolizing life as it continues to progress with all these detours and pit stops and whatnot that show up in the other kinds of sounds you have on the track. And so, I love that track, and that really just gets at this thinking in the soul, as you were talking about, this beautiful fusion. Third stage is also bargaining. So the dope thing that's happening in the third stage is not only are you trying to think in terms of memory loss, like we were thinking initially, but also in terms of bargaining. That's the stage when you're grieving something. You're like, well, what if something had happened? What if Trump had just actually been good with the vaccine? Or what if I hadn't let my grandma visit that person and she hadn't contracted COVID, or etc. We were trying to create this arc within the music without words in a way that would then allow people to be accompanied in their stages of grief during this whole COVID fiasco. And then the fourth stage is around depression and so on. Short track can have some elements of sadness in it. And also this cyclical nature, which is often how depression works. You don't really feel like getting up for a long period of time. Don't want to get out of bed day after day after day after day. Lose motivation day after day after day. And the last track is Glimmer, which is shorthand for the phrase glimmer of hope. And that is pointing to what can come once we've accepted and moved into a new stage at the end of grief. So, that's the project. That's what we're doing. And the last thing I'll say is Nova Zai came with this beautiful visual depiction of the record for the cover, where it's basically this big old, basically like a crypt. And you even see the skeleton in there, and then you see through the door beyond, you kind of see into the world beyond. And there's an infinity sign in the middle, which again kind of speaks to this notion of eternal.
Yeah, bro, it's a beautiful project, and it meant a lot to me when it dropped and throughout, phases of being quarantined and being isolated and all of that. So it speaks to the beauty of music and its power. It's not surprising to me that y'all started this project years ago, or that phrase came up years ago, and that it, as a listener, meant so much to me in this particular place and time, because similar to the contents that you just broke down, music often is a time machine, right? It's often a thing that can transcend linear time. I'm not surprised that it did what it did and that it exists how it exists, and I'm grateful for it, for real.
Wow, man. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you to everybody on this podcast who listens and who supports, and I hope that this music accompanies you through whatever it is you've lost during the pandemic.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you talked a little bit about A Creative's Word, the series that you're starting, the fusion of the spoken word, preached word, storytelling with your musical gifting. Yeah. I have a question for you. This is a quick question, right? Like, when you're playing on those, and you did you did a show, was it November? Was it back in November?
So that's different. So the show
that was inherited though, right?
That was inherited, yeah.
Yeah, but that is different. But my question though, like when you break out into these beautiful keystrokes of genius, was what I call them, right? When you break out, are you improvising, or is that something that you've planned or written, or is it a combination of both?
No, that is entirely in the moment. When I'm preaching and then all of a sudden I catch a spirit, as they say in the olden days, when my soul gets happy, I break out into that. And it really came from just hearing and studying and being around a lot of dope Black preachers throughout my life. And you just, see the beautiful age-old tradition of Black preachers who get happy and they get to singing, or they get to hollering, or they get to moving, or they get to groaning, all the things all the Africanisms that come, with us overseas.
Yeah. I love how the embodied preached or spoken word from, particularly Black church experience infuses itself into your art. Yeah. And I was wondering, right, because you also come from jazz, which is again a fusion of these different Black expressions, religious, non-religious. Yeah. And I'm just like, yo, what is the power of improvisation? Because that's a piece that is just so big in our communities, whether it's the preaching moment, whether it's jazz, whether it's the rap idiom and rap language. There's all types of ways that we improvise, and I'm like, yo, how do you access that power? What's your point of entry for that?
I don't know. Well, I like chords like these. I like chords that have a lot of tension right in the middle, like that. But I also like chords that, even with that tension, they're embedded within a greater sense of peace or consonance. So it sounds, even with the tension, it leads to something that maybe feels a little rounder, less sharp, less pokey. So I kind of love just getting into the moment like that. And I oftentimes, not always, but I'm oftentimes thinking about, what does the listener need to hear right now? And how is that connecting with what I'm doing? Now, a cool thing that has emerged more and more as I'm doing more solo work is that it's given me a chance to really tap into the inner wells of peace that I have, that I don't even always detect, but typically come out in my playing. And I think when I'm most focused in my playing is very peaceful. Some people, when they're most focused, their playing is very bombastic. It's very in your face. I mean, Train was incredibly locked in, and a lot of his stuff, Coltrane stuff, man, that stuff was intense.
Bruh, listen.
But I think for me, it comes from my contemplation of God. It comes from my contemplation of the world, and hopefully even my contemplation of the audience. And so that once I get in with a chord like this or a chord like this, then I start to move around as the Spirit leads, as I'm thinking about who's listening to this podcast, thinking about my brother on the other line interviewing me. And then sometimes I just like surprise at the end. So instead of going, I instead went up a half step to go. And that's a real churchy thing, new age jazz thing, to surprise like that. So, you're a rapper, we vibing. So I'm like, why not?
You vibe.
So all these things are flowing through my head, sometimes consciously, sometimes just subconsciously, but how I enter the moment, how I expand upon the moment, and then how I end it.
There's a lot in there. You just broke that down. And there's so many points of reference to this, right? And points of entry. Again, there's so many fusions. There's so many things being thrown into a pot. This is the gumbo I be talking about. This is the gumbo that is so rich with so much, man. And so much gets packaged, repackaged, emulated, honored through these renderings of expression. And it's brilliant, bro. It is.
Man, thank you.
I'm wondering, I'm wondering too, like you broke this down really well, where artists create, theologians reflect, and of course it's not that binary. So I'm wondering what you think creation's relationship is to reflection, and what reflection's relationship is to creation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was talking about this with my dad once, and I gave him this age-old adage where this composer from Europe said, you can keep your laws, just give me the music to change, and that'll change society, or something like that. And it was a really powerful quote. I should probably memorize it because it was so deep. And so basically I gave a version of it to my dad as a thought experiment, and I was like, Dad, what do you think about this phrase? To change a society, change its music. And he was like, I can see that, but on the other hand, I think music equally reflects society, reflects the culture, reflects where we are. So that was a really cool both and, because I was like, yeah, I'm down with that quote. I like that quote. If the music changes, the culture changes, when you change the values, then people, they listen to music in a way that they don't listen to other things. And again, they will remember music in a way that they may not even remember their name in 60 years. So I like the fact that music can create something and thereby change something just by virtue of calling something a being that was just a watery mass of matter prior to, which is how God created at the beginning according to Genesis. But then on the other hand, I think creating also serves as a reflection of where the artist is at the moment, It serves as a reflection of where we are as a society at a moment. If you're doing careful work, you're listening for both. So, of course, theologians are doing this too. They're creating speech about God, and they're also reflecting back to the people what God has given them and even where society is. So a great example of this in music shows up in how songs end. Now, I kind of just talked about this a second ago, but it probably is worth explaining again. So a very standard way to end music in a European setting would be something like this. It's called a perfect authentic cadence. It's just a very technical term to talk about a certain way of ending. We hear that kind of music all the time in Bach or Mozart, all this in Europe. And what I've been interested in is looking at how these kinds of endings in music reflect something about society. They reflect a kind of propriety or a kind of stability that's present in the music. Now, compare that, the propriety or stability that might have been present in, say, colonialist Europe in the 1700s and 1800s. Compare that kind of stability or sense of decorum and propriety with the way that this song ends by Thelonious Monk. Now, this, in terms of how our ear understands harmony, is not a simple ending. It doesn't give you the kind of clarity or the kind of home sense, the full stability or the peace that we get when we hear this from Mozart or Bach. Well, Monk was creating music in the 1900s during a time when his people, Black Americans, they were going through and still are going through hell and high water just to live. So giving the sense of a nice, simple home didn't necessarily reflect where he was. Again, this is back to the point about reflection versus creation. So instead of ending here, which is actually what this chord wants to do, this chord, an F7 chord, wants to end on B flat. That's traditionally where it would have gone. But in his case, he stays on the point before home. He stays on that point of tension. He says, there's a chord that could come that would lead you home. But this is actually our home that's filled with tension, that's not really home, but not really away. And it's a beautiful way that's present throughout the blues, throughout gospel, throughout any black form created in this country. It's a way of getting at the lack of stability, the lack of propriety, the lack of decorum afforded to black bodies and black life. And it comes through in these beautiful ways that allows, again, for beauty to be coming from all the pain and suffering that we have faced, have been subjected to, but also thrive yet still in the midst of. So I love that about how musical endings even reflect something about society. And I've been doing some thinking on that and teaching on that. So I want to just share that here, especially in Black History Month, where, you know, you and I both stand in the legacy of such powerful black musicians who knew how to end either in a way that showed our pain or in a way that might have looked for a hope, you know, of a simple ending, even if that's not one that we actually have. So I love how music can be aspirational and music can be reflective of where we are.
Yeah, I love that. Aspirational and reflective. That's it. And what you're talking about is the power of how music encapsulates human experience.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right? Even in its form, it captures the content and the angst, the urging, the yearning of the people who are creating that form, which is so rich and deep within the Black historical music tradition. Thank you for calling us towards that. You know, you in one of your creative words, you talk about how creatives in this moment in particular are going to have something special and new to say.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about not only what folks have created during this last year as the world has, you know, obviously been really crazy, but also like what's coming.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
Yeah, man.
You know, what folks are going to be saying, how that human experience will be expressed in song, given the history that we have flowing through us and the history that we're informed by. I'm curious about that, man.
Me too. And I'm really excited, especially given the history of one of my musical lineages, jazz, because jazz takes off after the last worldwide pandemic. After the Spanish flu of 1918, you get the jazz age of the 1920s. You get the roaring 20s, and jazz really becomes the lingua franca of America's soundscape for a while. All this pent-up energy from being cooped up at home and all the death and all the loss and all the disruption then leads to this new explosion of sound. And now we're poised for another explosion. I hope a new genre. I hope several new genres of music. And I think that is also, like with the Spanish flu, that's going to happen now, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the continual changes in technology. So in the case of jazz, there was a lot of music initially centered on the clarinet, but we wanted to start hearing music that was faster and higher than what a clarinet could do. And then the saxophone came along and really took on center stage. So that's just one example of how technological innovation in jazz changed in the 20s and 30s. As you went from the Riverwalk and the music of New Orleans, you went with that music that was heavily based on clarinet. You went deeper and deeper into the genre as it started to form, and you end up getting sax, and drum kit came along, and all the things that we now just see as a standard, double bass as opposed to a tuba. Like, all these technological changes then led to all these changes in music. I think similarly now, with the advent of streaming in the last decade, and then also the advent of all these other ways of making music, the democratization of music making, you don't having to go into fancy studios anymore. You can record from your laptop, and people are buying that music. I mean, Billie Eilish sweeping the Grammys, and her songs are, recorded on her bed. I mean, with that happening now at an increasing pace, I just suspect that music is going to change in all kinds of ways, as you just get now new sounds that are starting to mix together, because people can put together Billie Holiday with Marvin Gaye next to some Cuba traditional indigenous music, and you could listen to all that in the span of 7 minutes. I mean, that just has to affect your ear. So yeah, I suspect with all the time people have had at the crib to listen, with all of the pent-up energy and consumers and audience members wanting to get back to sound, I'm hopeful that there'll just be a huge explosion a la the 20s.
Yeah, I think you're right about the explosion. I'm particularly excited about two things. One is, not only with the advancement of technology do I think there's going to be new things that come out and new sounds, I'm also interested in the rediscovery of old things.
Yes, amen. Mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And a revaluing of voice, especially in-person voice, because we've been away from it for so long. Older forms of technology, I'm curious about whether or not those are going to be rediscovered.
Yeah.
And I'm excited about that, because there'll be a fusion, right, of new technology with maybe old forms or old formats. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, me too. And you definitely see that with the recovery of vinyl by audiophiles, and people getting into cassette and figuring out weird ways to do tape deck stuff, and people wanting the old film look and all this. Yeah, so I see that. But I think also, to return to our earlier conversation, this might seem like a left turn, about artistry and faith. What I've been really struck by, as I've spent so much time studying the architecture of organized faith, and certainly sitting right in the middle of it, is not only does your faith give you, if you identify as I do as Christian, not only are you talking about like this worldwide faith, you're also talking about something extraordinarily old, and something that's transnational, something that's been in a billion languages, something that has traveled the world and morphed in all kinds of ways. So the fact that the person I'm most devoted to in my life lived 2,000 something years ago in Palestine as a poor Jew who was colonized, who comes from a people whose history before him traced back 2,000 years as well, is just staggering. And so I think then there's always built into having any kind of faith that endures, that's been passed down, let alone from like your mama, your grandma, let alone then from, again, 10 centuries ago, or obviously longer, 20 centuries ago. When you have things that are that old that you're contending with, when you're reading languages that are 3,000 years old, you therefore just kind of have to have some kind of appreciation for the technologies and the innovations that have come before, because your whole life is based on that. Your whole life is based on antiquity, in a sense, and this fusion of antiquity and modernity, which, any modern day believer of any faith is contending with. I'm really interested in how my faith will just kind of, by the definition of the mechanics of it, will naturally kind of keep me attuned to lineages, keep me attuned to the past, keep me interested in what's come before, because I spend so much time naturally thinking about the past. If you ever quote scripture, you're quoting something from 2,000 to 3,000 years old, which is just crazy.
Yeah.
And then you're spending your money on it. You are making yourself vulnerable to it. You're orienting your family around it. You're studying that in school. You're writing articles about it. You're thinking about how these 2,000-year-old related peoples are voting in an election, like evangelicals or, mainline Protestants or whatever the language is. I don't care. Catholics, Joe Biden. Right. These things are super old, and yet they have all this purchase still in modern life. And I find that fascinating. So I think that just has to reflect then in the sensibilities one has towards past iterations of technological advancement in music.
Yeah. That actually relates to the second thing I'm excited about, right? The reason it relates to it, the second thing I'm excited about, is because my understanding or perspective on justice is rooted in my faith tradition. And the second thing that I'm excited about when it comes to what new music will spring forth from this moment is the orientation towards justice that I think maybe will emerge.
Yeah.
And I think it already has to some degree, right? I've heard so much more music from so many more artists, especially big artists, that are aligning itself with stories of justice or stories, or at least explorations or aspirations towards stories of justice.
Yeah, man.
Again, that's something that's ancient, right? The biblical text is filled with stories of people pursuing justice. A lot of people who are pursuing justice now rely on language and stories and models from that ancient text. So
that's a great point.
I'm curious about how that will look. As a person who identifies as a truth teller and a griot, I'm curious as to whether or not that expression of music will see more light.
Absolutely.
Or have a different value in, capitalist language, the marketplace, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm excited though, man. I am. I'm excited about it, and we're gonna see what happens. And the thing is, people like us are going to create regardless, and I think we have a call to do that. And I think there are other people in our communities and our networks who also doing that, come what may or come what doesn't. I think this next decade is going to roar a little bit. We're going to see.
Oh, that's raw. This next decade is going to roar. I like that.
Yeah, I think we're going to see, man.
Yeah, and it's, right on time in terms of, 2021 at the beginning of it. And, my hope for you, JP, and for the people listening to you and people listening to this podcast is that we inspire each other. I hope that people are listening to the beat of your drum and they're like, dang, okay, maybe I got to pour something out for the homie, That they're young folk listening to you, rapping about New York, rapping about your childhood, rapping about all the ways you feel paranoid or feel safe, feel joy or feel fear, or all that together.
Yeah.
And that they take cues from you to do the same. And that's been really inspiring to see, because you kind of helped pave the way for me to be doing the work I'm doing, having gone to divinity school yourself, having gone to the same undergrad as well. There's certainly a route that you could have been on, and there's a route I could have been on, but seeing you do what you were doing helped inspire me to be about a certain kind of work, a certain kind of truth-telling, a certain kind of prizing of creativity that I might not otherwise had done, were it left up to the conventional logics around me, around us. I think with the pandemic and all of the assassinations and murders over this past summer, I hope that people are inspiring each other.
Yeah.
And that there will just be a wave. I come back to a way that you talked about a miracle in the Gospels. You were helping me think through the Fish and Loaves, which is a very popular miracle story in which Jesus directs his disciples to go feed this huge starving throng of people who've come to listen to Jesus teach. And the disciples are confused and skeptical because there's no food and they're very far away from places that would be able to provide such bounty for the people. And Jesus says, don't worry. And matter of fact, this kid comes up and gives his food. And what you tipped me to as a really interesting thought experiment and the possibility of how this miracle unfolded was perhaps the miracle was everybody who had food, seeing the boy give his, felt so inclined to do the same. And such that at the end there was such a leftover because people have been inspired by each other's generosity and goodwill nature to share what they had, and they did the same. And I really, really would hope that there'd be more of that spirit in this country, where the boy didn't say to everybody, come on, chip in, assuming that they had food to do. But the boy shared what he had, and he basically was like, come what may. I think in our society where there's such a barrage of data for anything you want to ever think about due to the internet age, it can just be so overwhelming to really take cues from anybody. Because as soon as you find somebody who's maybe inspiring, you can go down in the thread and see somebody critiquing the daylight out of them.
Yeah.
And so then everything can just seem like another data point to just consider, but actually not act upon. I'm hopeful that in this next decade, as we come out, that there are new habits that we create, that there's new practices that we stand by, practices of modeling, of emulating one another in the ways that yield to generosity, yield to abundant life together. Yeah, those are practices that we seek to embody. And artists can really help lead the way with that. And I'm excited for what you can do, JP, and what I can do, and what everybody who's like-minded in the arts can do in terms of modeling a certain way of being generous, modeling a certain way of having faith, modeling a certain way of living in the world that brings us together. Those are habits I'm really excited for. Yeah,
man. You certainly are a good steward of your gift to that effect.
Thanks, man.
And I'm grateful to be in community with you and to have inspired you and to be inspired by you. It gives me a lot of joy to hear you talk that talk. And, we talked about joy came up earlier in the conversation, and I have been orienting all of my conversations for the podcast towards joy, because through everything, through all of the trial, tribulation, turmoil, loss, personal and communal, it's important to still orient ourselves towards joy.
100%.
And I can't let you get off this podcast, out of this conversation, without asking you how you are experiencing joy these days.
I laugh a lot more with my wife. That is great.
That's
man,
real.
Just joking. I let myself dance a lot more. I just dance around the crib. And I allow myself to make silly jokes that aren't super logical or whatever. I just be, this is funny, so I'm gonna say it. Just flowing like that. And of course, I just love playing. And I think cleaving to my loves and really just saying, I love this. And that's good enough. That's those kinds of affirmations of what I'm into. Man, that's been helpful. Man, this makes me feel good. Reading this book makes me feel good. Talking to this person makes me feel good. And I take that cue from how creation goes down in Genesis 1, where God is like, that's good. That's good. That's good. Shoot, this is all real good. And I used to just see that stuff as incidental, but I'm realizing, man, that's actually really helpful. Like this podcast, this conversation is good. And just saying that, even you listening to this, it's good that you're here. Thank you for being here, for real. Just, making those simple statements, this is good. That actually buoys me. It gives me joy, and it helps me hold to what is true. And the more I reflect on the God who gives joy, the more I'm like, this joy I have, the world didn't give it, and the world certainly can't take it away. And, I have various feelings about, government or leadership or, all the American exceptionalism that we're down with. I'm just not with that stuff. Probably in part because I married a Canadian. So whenever we're on that tip of rah rah America forever, she's like, all right, homie. Yeah. But be that as it may, the point is, I'm actually wresting back from the hands of all these externalities my joy. I used to leave it with all these folk or all these things that were happening, and that was more about happiness, not necessarily joy. So to have joy that suffuses my life, regardless of what's going on beyond it, man, that's just giving me a lot more power. And then keeping creating, like spending as much time of each day creating and then saying, man, this is good. This is good.
Yeah.
Man, this is good. I love doing that. And the more I do that, the more then I want to create more, the more confident I feel, the more desirous I feel of sharing. And all that then, redounds in more joy.
Bruh. Thank you, man.
Yeah, yo.
I just want, and you mentioned the creative part and what you've said on a creative's word, which is helpful and to share with anybody we come in contact with, is that we all are creating.
Yes.
We all have an opportunity to make a thing, create an experience, create a memory, and say that's good.
Yes.
We all have access to that.
One thing, I think especially for Black folk, just declaring that something is good, declaring that you are good, declaring that your skin color is good, not even having to relate it to like we were once kings and queens or not all that stuff, but just saying that it's good.
Period.
Man. Yeah, it doesn't have to be tied to royal domination. We once, dominated people and could kill, So it doesn't really get us out of the problem. But just to say, I'm good. I like my skin. I like your skin, JP.
Glowing.
You know what I'm saying? Like those simple sentences, they're so powerful. Especially when so much of our child rearing, how we're reared, is in terms of narrations of antagonism. Don't go here, watch out for that, we gotta have to talk, or don't be over there playing with them, or whatever it is. The list goes on of things that are the don'ts for the sake of your survival. Work harder because you darker, all this stuff. It then puts us in all these rat races, the guinea pigs, the hamsters, all the animals, whatever animal you want to use, we become all them things. But when I just say I am good, yeah, it reminds me of this. I saw this picture of this sister once who had her hair natural, and she was like, "The hair growing out of my head is not a political statement." I was like, "Dang, that is heavy." But that's again, it's like the same logic, right? It was just good, not because of all these things that have been contra me, but just because it is.
Yeah,
heavy, man, heavy. Wow,
Whew. That is heavy. And that is good. And that is a good place to say thank you.
Thank you, man.
Say thank you, for all of the things, for the wisdom you bestowed, for the vessel that you are, for the obedience, again, towards the vocation, towards the calling, to live into the multiple identities that you have and the multitude of skill sets and questions that you have as well. Thank you for that.
Man, thank you.
Period, because it is good.
Ooh,
right?
Beautiful.
Because it is good. And thanks to all the listeners for tuning in, for jumping in these convos and for sticking along and going on this journey all over the place. All of these conversations have been powerful to me, and I'm grateful to you in particular, Julian, tonight, because this was uplifting. I needed this one tonight, man.
Amen,
I needed this
bro.
one. So thank you, man. We'll text again soon in real life. And
please,
the conversation continues, the journey continues. But I'm grateful that you stopped in to share a little bit tonight with me, man.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No doubt, bro. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stir Crazy. Don't forget to follow the podcast at Stir Crazy Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. On Twitter, you can find me at Stir Crazy Pod. This is a completely independent venture, so your subscriptions and donations are more than welcome. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/JP Reynolds. Thank you. Peace and power to you. See you next Tuesday.
Another plane, I need innovation. Another plane, I don't mean vacation. Another plane, I don't do the basic. Another plane, I don't need to chase it.
Peace and power.
True.